Hello, everyone. My name is Carla Liesching, and I am here today with two of my very dear friends, Pablo Lerma and Kelsey Sucena. We are here to discuss my recent publication, Good Hope, which was just released by MAC in late 2021. Good Hope is an assemblage of image and text that centers around the gardens and grounds at the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa. I can give you a visual. The Cape of Good Hope was historically, it was a historic site, I guess, at the height of empire, and is now an epicenter for anti-colonial resistance movements. It's also the place of my birth. It was named in 1488 by Portuguese explorers who viewed the site with great optimism and sort of named it as such. They named it the Cape of Good Hope because of its position as a perfect midpoint along the spice route, so between kind of like east and west. And the colony that was later established there at the Cape of Good Hope, the Cape Colony, indeed set into motion flows of capital from east to west, enabling large-scale colonial expansion, and then, of course, all of the awful histories that go along with that expansion. So I've asked Kelsey and Pablo to join me today, partly because their practices and ways of working, methodologies overlap with mine quite a lot. And then also, perhaps not surprisingly, we were classmates once upon a time in our MFA program, Image Text Ithaca. So they've really seen the project in its earlier stages before it was even called Good Hope. They really saw the kind of birth of the project and have seen all of the various iterations right up into this beautiful object, thanks to MAC. So before we dive in, I would like to thank MAC for hosting us. And I would also like to introduce my esteemed guests. So I'm going to read apologies in advance. Kelsey Sucena is a trans non-binary photographer, writer, and park ranger, currently residing on Long Island. Their work rests at the intersection of photography and text, often within the bodies of performative slideshows and phototext books. Their work is centered broadly upon the United States as a site for anti-capitalist, queer, and critical reflection. Kelsey is an MFA graduate from Image Text Ithaca, managing editor of The Photo Captionist, and a freelance writer. Notably, they recently worked on What They Saw, historical photo books by women, which has been winning a plethora of awards. So exciting. And they're also included in Humble Arts Foundation's current exhibition, Pained Vistas, that engages landscapes framed by conflict, trauma, and beauty. Congratulations, Kelsey. It's all such exciting stuff.
Yeah,
okay. Pablo Lerma is a Spanish research-based artist, educator, and publisher based in Amsterdam. His artistic practice is developed at the intersection of image and text, with a focus in visual archives and vernacular materials dealing with notions of collective memory, representation, and queerness. Currently, he is a lecturer in social practice and photography at Willem de Kooning Academy in Rotterdam, and a faculty member in media studies at Webster University in Leiden. In the last decade, he served as a faculty member in photography and social justice at the International Center of Photography, back when I was his boss. And as a professor in photography at Keene University in New Jersey. He is the founder of the publishing house Meteoro Editions, based between the US and the Netherlands. Meteoro Editions is a platform to create art publications with a focus on projects gravitating around vernacular photography, archives, utopias, and fictional representations of the world. And with that, I will pass the mic over to Kelsey, who will get us going with our conversation.
Yeah, so first I just wanted to thank you, Carla, for inviting me and Pablo to speak. It's a real pleasure to just having encountered this project over the years, to see how it's transformed, to see all of its different versions. I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to like spend time with it all together, because I feel like I've seen it in so many snips over the years. So many thanks to Mac for that, for making that happen. I'm also really excited that other people now have the opportunity to spend the time with the work. It's changed a lot, and it's also really kept its core over the years. For me, it really arrives at what I think is like a critical moment within the evolution of photography, as archives are sort of digitized and as colonial histories really come into focus. On the surface, the book is ostensibly about good hope and everything that good hope, the phrase, the place, the history represents. But on a deeper level, the work is really about representation or representation, in the sense that photographs and archives can be represented for reinterpretation. So before we get too deep into our discussion, I was hoping you could talk about the politics from which this project emerges. It must be said that South Africa, as in the United States, within those places, there's been these important cultural shifts as movements like Rhodes Must Fall have demanded reconsiderations of history away from these biased lenses of historical oppression, colonial violence, anti-Blackness, and imperialism more broadly. So can you tell us a little bit about the politics behind the project, the movements, the protests that it takes shape around, and also maybe a little bit about some of the folks who inspired you?
Sure, thank you for that great question. Yeah, so the book moves back and forth in time between a historical moment and a present moment, as you say. The historical moment, of course, being the arrival of the ships to colonize, to create the colony, and then a present reality, a present moment that is deeply, incredibly inequitable, but also incredibly powerful in terms of the, like you said, the resistance movements and the cultural shift that is happening thanks to those movements. In general, I think the people that inspire me the most in life, you know, beyond the book, are young people. As Pablo knows, I work with teens and young adults, and there's a reason that I work with them. They do inspire me. So the student movements, such as Rhodes Must Fall, and then the later movement called Fees Must Fall, and various land justice movements that were connected, very much informed the project Good Hope. And I had the tremendous privilege of being able to speak with many of the young activists and students who are kind of on the ground. You know, all of these movements are really struggling for the removal of colonial symbols in public space. They are struggling for a counter curriculum. They're struggling to prioritize forms of knowledge, indigenous forms of knowledge and other forms of knowledge that were previously dismissed by the Western canon. They are fighting for free education for all. They're fighting for, as I said, land justice, and an end to economic apartheid. What you have to understand is, or to put it in context, white South Africans make up 9% of the population, and yet they own 72% of the land, private land in South Africa. So even though it's kind of 30 years post-apartheid now, the geography and the colonial structuring of the country and the economic aspects of the country. It's very much still in place. I thought actually I might take a moment to read some pieces, partly because I would like to give our listeners some context about what I mean when I say a movement between the past and the present, and how that movement functioned in the work, and then also, of course, the student movements. And so I think I'll read some parts from the beginning, and then I'll skip to a little later where I conduct an interview. The southeasterly howls, and I sit idle, imagining myself on the dromedary sailing towards the Cape of Good Hope. It is not yet named the Cape of Good Hope, but has another name, sometimes many names, sometimes no name at all. I stand at the helm of the ship with my face to the wind and the mountain towering above. I am from the future, and my special knowledge of what is about to happen makes me queasy. I get up out of my chair and pace around the house. At the University of Cape Town, I'm in the sun, soaking up the salty ocean breeze. I'm halfway up the stairs leading to a lecture hall when a young woman named Norma and I strike up a conversation. I tell her why I am here: to conduct interviews with students involved in the Roads Must Fall, Fees Must Fall, and related land justice debates. She shakes her head, laughs, slumps her body in a theatrical gesture of exhaustion. The Roads Must Fall movement made global headlines on the 9th of March 2015, when political science student Chimane Maxwele carried a bucket of human feces from Khayelitsha, an impoverished township or Black area designated as such under apartheid laws, and threw it on a central statue commemorating Cecil John Rhodes, a 19th century British imperialist and politician who bequeathed to UCT the land on which it is built. Maxwele's act signified mounting unrest on campus, resulting in occupations, walkouts, sit-ins, barricades, and various symbolic happenings. Debate raged over what should be done with the statue as it grew into a potent ready-made emblem, enveloped in excrement, garbage bags, paint, planks, tape, and the bodies of protesters scaling its height. 1 month later, on the 9th of April, the statue was removed and its granite pedestal was boarded up with grey plywood. Reported to be the largest wave of protests in post-1994 democratic South Africa, RMF mobilized widespread direct action at universities across the country, opposing institutional racism and the continued colonial structuring of education and knowledge production. The fall of Rhodes is symbolic for the inevitable fall of white supremacy, declared UCT RMF representatives. Norma tells me how she was in her final year at a nearby high school when the first wave of protests began. I would come to the university campus after school every day to protest on the periphery. I was with them, you know, but I couldn't get too close. I had my future to worry about, especially in the second wave with Fees Must Fall. The police were everywhere and protesters were being shot at with rubber bullets. There was tear gas. Some of the student leaders were academically expelled, even criminally charged. And then the next year, my first year here, there was Shackville, there was the burning of artworks, then there were the total shutdowns. The classes were constantly cancelled. We couldn't write exams, it was mayhem. I actually ended up deregistering, so a whole year was wasted. And we were being called undemocratic heathens and barbarians. It took an emotional toll. I just kept asking myself, why am I even here? Norma and I discussed democracy on campus. Why undemocratic? And who exactly was making these accusations? I ask. Well, a lot of people, she replies. The administration, a few professors and students, the press. It was just floating around, mostly whites. They were saying that the fallists were actually not a majority of UCT students, so our complaints and rallies were undemocratic because we supposedly weren't respecting the majority consensus, you know. I can't help but wonder aloud what seems like an obvious question. What value is there in a majority consensus if the majority are unimpeded by the issues in question? Isn't unevenness of access and financial exclusion the very problem? Yeah, replies Norma. Democracy is a charade here, no matter how you look at it. We fall silent on the steps, looking down on the makeshift plywood structure covering up the statue's pedestal, then up a Jamison Memorial Hall, standing tall on the emerald green slope, its rooftop echoing the triangular shape of Devil's Peak in the background. It's all so beautiful, but those white columns, she laughs. I am reminded of a book on my shelf at home, Whitewashing Race. It considers the effects of organized white privilege across North American institutions. White Americans can be sanguine about racial matters because their race has not been visible to the society in which they live. They cannot see how this society produces advantages for them because these benefits seem so natural that they are taken for granted. They literally do not see how race permeates the very rules of the game. This feels accurate, except I pause when reading The Society. Who is being made invisible here? I mean, he was right in the middle of campus, Norma says. We had to walk around him every day. And the whole point was to say that he held in place a certain version of history that felt dehumanizing for Black students and staff. It was alienating, but we're tired now. We're in self-protection mode. The anger, though, the spirit of it all is still simmering underneath. You can feel it. It could surface at any moment. Whiteness, Sarah Ahmed writes, is only invisible for those who inhabit it. Spaces are oriented around whiteness, and the effect of this around whiteness is the institutionalization of a certain likeness, which makes non-white bodies feel uncomfortable, exposed, visible, different when they take up the space. To be comfortable is to be so at ease with one's environment that it is hard to distinguish where one's body ends and the world begins. One fits, and by fitting, surfaces of bodies disappear from view. She adds that it is important to remember when we talk about a sea of whiteness or a white space, we are talking about the repetition of the passing by of some bodies and not others, for sure. But non-white bodies do inhabit white spaces. We know this. Such bodies are made invisible when we see spaces as being white, at the same time as they become hypervisible when they do not pass, which means they stand out and stand apart. Table Mountain is known as Hurikwacho by the Khoisan, indigenous people of the Cape. Hurikwacho, meaning the mountain which arose from the sea, was named this way for the seashells found all the way up the summit. Sitting on the steps with Norma, squinting up at the mountain against the midday sun, I glimpse for a second the 6 Roman columns of Jamison Memorial Hall falling. The pale granite crumbles downwards, the garden at the foot burns and debris fills the air. The seashells pile up like funeral pyres. Hurikwacho, what hopes can grow here? Sweat stings my eyes and my vision blurs, while Norma continues. There was an open letter published in the newspaper comparing RMF to the Taliban, ISIS, and Boko Haram, calling the vandalizing of the statue terrorist attacks. But you know, let's not forget this nation was always built on obliteration. In a document that formed the basis for a public lecture addressing UCT students in 2015, Professor Kiel Mbembe declared, "Democracy will either be built on the ruins of the version of whiteness that produced Rhodes, or it will fail. Those versions of whiteness must be decommissioned if we are to free ourselves from our entrapment in white mythologies and open a future for all here and now. Norma suddenly realizes the time. She has to go to class. But before she leaves, she smiles warmly. I feel optimistic these days. It's a new year. I'm looking up. I'm keeping my head high. We embrace. Then she turns, continues up the stairs.
I think that was so beautiful to.
Thank you. I hope it
to hear
wasn't
your
too
voice.
long.
Yeah, I think it was really beautiful to listen to your voice, and especially like knowing the entire process and like being there from the beginning, even like listening different excerpts that you've been reading aloud when we were in the program at ITI. I think kind of like I don't know, I mean, going through your book and reading, I can kind of like hear your voice, but again, kind of like going through this performatic moment of like listening, it's kind of like embodying more the text, and I really appreciate it. Hopefully this could be like an entire podcast where we can
Yeah,
listen
maybe.
to you reading through the entire book. Well, as you know, Carla, I mean, we have so many questions, I think, Kelsey and I, since we've been talking about this, but one of the questions that I kind of like ask you, it's the relation that you build with the book and the details that you pay to the materials, that they've been there throughout the different dummies that you've been creating. So can you explain us more about that process of selecting materials, thinking about options to make the book for this, to bind the book in this project?
Thank you for that question. Pablo and I have taken many bookmaking classes together, and he knows that many of my books tend to be extremely finicky in terms of the materials. There's often like 100 different paper stocks and things falling out of the book when you open it. And, you know, I definitely appreciate or always think about the way that a book feels in your hand. And I approach it conceptually, but also thinking about, like you were mentioning, reading as embodiment, but also holding the book. I think about the body and the person's body reading the book. So thinking about how it's held in the hand. And for the Good Hope, I approached it very differently to previous books where, like I said, there was a lot of different paper stocks and things like that. I wanted to simplify with Good Hope so that, first of all, I could reproduce it more widely, you know, so when you're making books that have all these kind of very handmade elements and finicky details, you are generally only making like 100 at very most, you know. And so I was designing it with even before I was speaking with Mac, I was just thinking about how to simplify so that I could publish it, you know, with someone on a kind of larger scale. And I was also, like I said, thinking about the reader, and because the book has so much text in it, I thought it was very important to think about that act of reading and how it feels to hold the book in your hand. I want people to be able to kind of lie in bed and read the book. And I feel like a big hardcover or anything like that would have discouraged reading, whereas the soft paperback, this kind of small-ish size, the paper stock is also fairly thin for a photo book. Because, you know, then the pages kind of just flip a little bit easier. So I was thinking a lot about the reader when I was thinking about the material. So, and on honoring the text, you know. And then on a conceptual level, I was designing the book as a kind of scrapbook turned encyclopedia, because so much of what I am exploring conceptually is about knowledge production, knowledge construction. I wanted to kind of have a little reference to the kinds of materials, the kinds of books that we usually look to for knowledge, or for kind of like the authoritative truth of the matter, you know, so textbook or a encyclopedia of sorts. And so I did that by things like the little green side notes, if I can find one, you know, if you're, and just taking little design strategies from encyclopedias and textbooks as a way to nod towards knowledge construction, but then also poke holes at it and subvert it through the questioning, the lines of questioning in the text, and through collage and so on.
I think the paper, the tactility of the book, it's really nice and definitely goes with these ideas that you're sharing. And also the fact that you're thinking about the source of the images and how they can be reproduced again. That it's, for me at least, is aligned with this feeling of like going through the pages. They're not too thick, as you said, they're like thin, then they kind of like break the idea of what it's a photo book. But also how the images are reproduced kind of like reminds me to encyclopedias and this idea of like using the image as a document that comes into the entire publication and becomes almost like a dossier of research where you have the text and the images. So I think that's, at least for me, that really transcribes throughout the entire publication. And I think that's something that also relates to the work that you do in the studio. And I think that's why it's so important, this sort of like connection, or how you're creating a bridge between the work that you do in the studio and how that work becomes part of a publication, where it's also solved in a publication form. So I'm always interested in knowing, how is that process for you? How the work that you create in the studio kind of like goes into the publication, or even, I don't know if that happened, things that you created in publication went back to the studio and they were like kind of like reimagined again.
It's totally happening now, actually. Yeah, when I started the project, you might remember this, actually, I was approaching the topic of whiteness quite broadly and abstractly. I would even say I was a little detached and removed, but I was basically kind of undertaking an investigation into the images of empire, and also what Claudia Rankin in the Racial Imaginary Institute, and the Racial Imaginary Institute, called block whiteness, which is a source of unquestioned power that feels itself to be endangered and lashes out even as it maintains its hold on power. So I was kind of like, I was in my studio, I was compiling this inventory, I would call it, of objects and pictures and things that I perceived to be in some way like building blocks of whiteness. And I don't know if you remember the studio series where I was kind of, they were always positioned in the center of the frame, and I was kind of creating this inventory as a way of examining whiteness, and I was writing notes about them at the same time, but I wasn't really thinking about the notes. They weren't very personal, I'll put it that way. And then, you know, thankfully, because I had such an incredible community around me and wonderful teachers and folks like you, both of you, you know, I realized very quickly that in order to examine whiteness from an honest place, I had to get very personal, you know, and that's when things started to change. And I really began to approach writing as a tool for kind of digging into the past, personal, present, political of my life, and the place that I call home, the place where I was born, Cape Town. And I was very influenced by, like, for example, Tanya Foster, Kelsey, I know, was also inspired by her. She's our guru, Tanya. And Tanya spoke about something called, if I remember correctly, divinatory poetics is what she called it. But this kind of like writing as a way of almost like divining for water. You know, you're searching, your eyes are closed, you're digging in the dark. There's who was like, so a wonderful poet, one of my favorites, Ankie Kroch. She's South African, and she also writes about how the process of writing and she says the psychic configurations we need to make, but she always speaks about needing to go underground. And there's also Helen Sissou. Renee Gladman told me to read her book, what's it called? 3 Steps on the Ladder of Writing. And Helen Sissou speaks about the ladder of writing. It goes down. It doesn't go up, it goes down to the depths. It goes down to your worst. And so the writing came to my aid, you know, in terms of kind of really doing an intuitive deep dive into the material in a very different way to how I had been working in the studio previously. Yeah, so the writing has kind of always been a guiding force in the work. And for the many years that I worked on this project, I had quite a rigorous studio practice, which I need to get back to that. But I would go to my studio every morning, and before I had spoken to anyone, I would go and sit down and write. And so the space of my dreams and the kind of fluid space of sleep blended into the writing. And by the time I'd kind of woken up, I was already kind of onto something, or maybe I wasn't, you know, but that was the process. And I wrote hundreds and hundreds of pieces of text that didn't make it into the book, you know. And then the images, they came later. And that's when my studio really started to explode. And I was kind of looking at it. I mean, I think you've seen pictures. I'm a mess. But I was looking at pictures and writing at the same time. And so the imagery and the writing started to blend together kind of naturally. It's very interesting, like you say, the kind of the way that one thing leads to the next. And where I'm at now is the book has started to become installation. It's becoming other things in physical space. And that's not something that I ever anticipated until I had made the book. And then from there, I started to think about how I could expand the book. So that's where I'm at now in terms of studio practice. I'm kind of playing with materials, seeing how I can kind of like puncture holes in the imagery, and in a way make these images of empire fall, you know, and fail. Yeah, I feel like I've been talking for a long time now.
No, I think it really makes sense. I mean, I think like the work, it's been moving back and forth, and it's kind of like nurturing each process, the writing and maybe like the image making, but more like image selection. Mm-hmm. I always feel like this sort of like a mess that can be around the studio, it's also a control mess, because you know where things are and how they're like connected. And maybe they're only connected in your head, but not in the physical space. But I think that's kind of like enough to take the next steps into the work.
Yeah, you know, and it's such an intuitive thing. I mean, I feel like you have a much more like you have quite a rigorous approach in terms of organization and methodology, and then you make rules and you stick to your rules, or not?
I try.
You try to. I mean,
yeah. I think I kind of like, I mean, I learned from you. Like, I remember like seeing like lots of materials around, and it's like, I need to try this, because for me, it has to be always so control my process and have all of these like categories of images and trying to understand the relations and kind of like having like almost like clear physical connections between the images. But I tried in the past to kind of like bring that mess into the process in order to find myself at some point. So I think it's this sort of like a back and forth process that we all need, and there is no formula, and that's something that I always think it's quite important to understand, that there is no formula, even though each of us have our own, let's say, quote unquote, formula to do the work.
Right.
Yeah, I think I deeply resonate with that sort of what I always describe as improvisational process, where you're working through images and working through text and arriving at ideas. But I like the word that you used, divination. I think that's very appropriate. And so like moving through this whole process, you end up with this gorgeous object, and it's a really beautiful object. And I think I resonated deeply with what you were saying about making it accessible, making design decisions that sort of allowed it to be this thing that can be manipulated and looked at almost as an academic text. And I've really like just beaten up my copy, written all over it.
I love it. I'm so glad you've done that.
And so one of the things that I was thinking about is how this sort of becomes almost, I mean, so the text itself is very different, but the object itself strikes me as almost like it's sort of authoritative or academic, which I think is interesting, because like as you move through the text, there's this meta narrative. It's like kind of a quiet meta narrative that starts to unfold, where you're sort of establishing the whole project as the product of your own like habit of collection, of collecting objects and looking through them. So you spend a lot of time in the text with that recognition, analyzing it and critiquing your own impulses, thinking about the collected archive that you were gathering, and those of imperial science, and colonial sciences. I can imagine just like running through that whole process and thinking about yourself collecting these items, and the relationship between that impulse for collection. You write directly about it within the text, and this sort of colonization, and this colonial science. I can imagine that process being like emotionally fraught for you. I was wondering if you could speak to that experience, what that was like. What is it like to recognize this sort of self-incriminating implication of that investigation?
Sure. I'll start actually just by saying, you're mentioning the kind of feeling of it, the textbook, the academic text. So the sort of package that it's delivered in has that feeling, but then that meta narrative that starts to unfold. At least what I was hoping to do there was to undermine the authority of the object, you know. Yeah. But absolutely, it was and continues to be an emotionally fraught process. But I think that it has to be, you know, white supremacy is violent and visceral, and the process of unlearning as well is naturally painful and frightening. Painful because you're kind of like shedding layers of yourself, and frightening in that you're entering new terrain. That's for any process of unlearning, right? So I think that it just has to be, and there's no way to avoid it. And ultimately, I think that the pain of self-critique, and how did you say, self-incrimination? I like that word. That pain is just no match for the pain of the everyday pain, right? Of living in fear because of the color of your skin, the pain of death and loss due to medical racism, police brutality, red zoning, and other forms of contemporary segregation, you know, and all of these things then trickle down into white supremacist vigilantes and mass shootings and storming of the Capitol. And there's a quote by an educator, Dwayne Reed, and I really love it. It's very simple, but it's just stuck with me. He says, white supremacy won't die until white people see it as a white issue rather than a black issue they need to empathize with. You know, I've been asked before, like, or I've been told that I should make work that's more personal because I'm writing about race and I'm white. So like, I should make work that's maybe about something that's more in line with my own experience. When actually, you know, of course I am raced, I am white, and this is very personal. I think we should be feeling pain. George Yancey, he says, white people need to die unto themselves. But anyway, I think to carry on the topic of self-incrimination, I don't think that it was not some kind of realization that I came to as an adult. It's been with me throughout my childhood, and it's kind of how I was brought up, because what you have to understand is I was 9 when the apartheid regime ended, and my first year school, like my grade 1 year, we called it sub A, but it was the first year of desegregated schooling. It happened just slightly before the first democratic election. So I grew up as a little girl, kind of very much aware of my whiteness and my complicit settler heritage. And so I think that makes it easier as well to speak about it. And I think South Africans in general, at least my generation and younger generations, tend to be quite aware and engaged socially and politically. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, what you were mentioning, I mean, it makes me think about in the beginning of the process of working in this publication, but I think kind of like generating all the writing, how you were kind of like sharing also these your personal experiences or your personal history in relation to more of like a collective memory in South Africa. So I don't know if we go maybe into that personal realm, but I don't know if you would like to kind of like maybe explain more about that, how you kind of like deal in these projects with this idea of the personal experience in relation to a collective memory, and how that it's important for you in this book to kind of like have these different voices throughout the text that come in place with images.
Oh, I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, I mean, I was going to say I would be remiss to speak of a sort of any kind of like coherent collective history in South Africa, you know, because it has been such a divided place for so many centuries. But to speak about my personal history and how that intertwines with the history of the country, and I deal with this in the text as well in the book, being careful not to center it, but again, acknowledge my personal history. The first of my family to arrive in South Africa was sent by the Dutch East India Company in service of the Cape Colony. They were sent as the first medical doctor to the colony. And in his capacity as a doctor, he also was very instrumental in the gardens and grounds that were essentially providing fresh produce and providing medicine for the passing ships. You know, and my family have been in South Africa since, so I don't take that history very lightly. It's of course, I think it's why I'm writing, why I wrote Good Hope. There've been loads of books written about my family because they were like this big medical family in the Cape Colony. And I kind of see myself as this like counter historian much later, coming along much later.
So there's a moment in the text I really like. I'll bring this up next. I recognize myself in it. You already mentioned Tanya.
Yeah.
I mean, she had a profound impact on my practice, and I know pretty much everyone who took her class did.
Right, she's amazing.
And it's this quote that you use on page 102, where you say, the drive to know is the same as the drive to kill. And I remember how deeply that resonated with me. And I see that idea present throughout this entire text, and not just present on the surface, but really just like you're grappling with the implications of that idea, sort of relating to my last question. I was wondering if there were like points throughout your research where you found yourself really contending with that, and what that experience might have been like for you. Like, were there any moments where you felt unable to proceed with the project, where you might have considered stepping away? Yeah, if you could talk to us a little bit about that.
Right, yeah, I mean, to name yourself is in some ways to enact violence. A smaller thing is naming oneself. You're saying like, I am me, here I am Carla, I am separate from you, you know, and the paradox of it all is that we are narrative beings, you know, we need language, I think, in order to connect, and yet, you know, each words, language itself, representation is inherently, there's a violent quality to it, and I think, if I'm answering you honestly, that Good Hope happened when I decided that I would not step away, that I wouldn't look away. I mean, I've been working or making work about this topic for like probably around a decade. I've been trying and failing in my studio, you know, and I think that, and I did, sorry, I lost my train of thought for a moment. I did step away, like for extended periods of time where I just felt, I was so frustrated, you know, with how do you make work that is, you make representational work about the violence of representation, you know, but eventually, you know, once you step away from your art, I mean, you and I have chatted a bit about like that question of what can art do? Like what, maybe this is an imaginary conversation I've had in my head with you, Kelsey.
No,
but I know that, you know, you are very interested in that question too, of can art make a difference at all? What is it, what is it doing? And I did get to a place where I was kind of so disillusioned with the idea of art being able to do anything that I stopped, and I went into arts education related social work. That's in the period of my life where I met Pablo, actually, and eventually I just became really depressed, I realized that making art is my way of processing. And so it just had to be my own quiet process of unlearning. And then the rest happens afterwards. But
yeah, I mean, I'd say I really grapple with that skepticism, that feeling that art is maybe a process that is somewhere between ineffective, redundant, deeply problematic in and of itself. And I sink into those very similar sort of depressions. I think, you know, that skepticism, as much as I have it, I also think quite often about art as a personal process. And I resonate deeply with what you were saying as far as allowing art to be your avenue for processing this information. And I think in the context of your work here and in this book, certainly a great way for me to process this information, for me as a reader to process that information. So while those questions remain and that skepticism of the efficacy of art for progress and change remains, I still feel as a reader of your work, as somebody who's viewed your work, as though I can at least proceed within the world more mindfully. So I don't know how much of a difference that makes on a grand scale, but it's a process that I appreciate and I'm glad that you initiated.
Thank you. I actually to respond to a much earlier question in terms of my inspirations, there's during the Rhodes Must Fall movement, there were a bunch of things that were then kind of described afterwards as performance art. They were protest acts, right? Like even Chimani Maxwele throwing feces onto a sculpture, onto a statue. That in itself, there were scholars saying, like, just looking at the connection between art and activism in really interesting ways. And there's a fantastic essay by a South African art critic called Tuli Gamitsi, and she frames the whole Rhodes Must Fall movement as an art discipline in and of itself. And I actually have a quote that I'll pull up and read. Appropriated by the press, our trajectory was framed as a tunnel vision campaign for the removal of a statue as the overarching solution to the removal of a regime. However, it soon became evident through the spread of must fall rhetoric, most notably in the Fees Must Fall campaign for free education in South Africa, that a new image, an alternative to pervasive Rhodes symbolism, had emerged into public imagination. This must fallness, I just love that word, must fallness, and it's written as one word, is an ideology that I understand as one speaking to decolonization, as a way to make space for new ideas and new ways of being. In this sense, the word standing before the must fall phrase always speaks to the notion of Rhodes and the colonial legacy of South Africa. In the case of Fees Must Fall then, Fees, the notion of wealth exclusionary education in the colony, directly addresses the problems of an unequal status quo. What I'm getting at with this background is that such a campaign relies on a collective image. This image is not a statue or a traditional art object, but a phrase that is formed through response to violent ideology, a phrase that symbolizes pain and anger and that symbolizes open space for something new. Must fall is a phrase, an image, a symbol, and we might even speak of it as an art discipline, not painting or photography, but a discipline of creative and risky thinking, and a discipline of mobilization and activism based on the desire to see new images and to create new symbols. But I love that, like it's, you know, an exercise in risky thinking.
I was thinking while you were reading, and Kelsey was also sharing with you their questions. It's how do you deal with all of these ethical questions when looking at materials and creating the work, and how there is a line conceptually with the project, also from like a from a material point of view, because I think I'm sure that those questions are happening and still in your practice, but also throughout the process. And if there are like certain methodologies that you use in order to kind of like transform those questions and those perhaps visual answers with images that you select into a conceptual material for the process.
Yeah, there are just a ton of ethical questions. There have been a ton of ethical questions along the way, and still are, you know, will always be. There is a great risk in this work, and we've already started to speak about this actually, of reifying the object of your critique, or remonumentalizing, reinscribing the thing you're trying to dismantle. And it's always like you're kind of grappling with that, right? Fragmentation and non-linearity in this kind of storytelling. I think that shakes up the authoritative voice, and it rejects a guise of like order and control, which I view as a hallmark of colonial versions of history. So the strategy of collage, it becomes subversive, right? And it then begs the question, what is being hidden? What more can we find here in these archives? There's also, of course, the question of the seductive quality of the images. They are made to seduce you and pull you in, right? And I constantly had to like walk this line of allowing, or at least trying to build a sequence where I allowed the viewer to get a little bit swept away in the beauty, and then puncture it somehow, whether it was a gestural puncturing, like by cutting and collage, or whether it was the writing in response to the image, or whether it was using contemporary images. I think that was very effective as well, or it helps, right? When you're looking at these historical images, and they're so beautiful and they're pulling you in, and then bam, we're seeing contemporary resistance. So that was also something to contend with. And then another thing, I mean, and I could probably go on forever about the ethical, the swampland of ethical questions, but something that was very important in the Rhodes Must Fall movement was dehumanizing images of Black people. And there was a whole artwork task force at UCT that reviewed all of the paintings and sculptures and art that was at the university, because of this problem of this whole long history, centuries and centuries of photographs of non-white people in really dehumanizing ways. And we know these, at least in our field, we are very familiar with that, those kinds of images, the ethnographic images of people from other lands. And of course, the photographers were white men, West European men. And when you're kind of trying to trace that history, talk about those images, but you're also trying not to show, or you're not wanting to do the same thing. And so I had to ask myself, with every single image, I had to make sure that the subject of the image, the object of scrutiny or subject of scrutiny in the picture was white violence, not black pain offered up for consumption, which is such a common trend in our field, and at least in like the photo world. But yeah, that the subject was, it needs to be white violence, you know. Yeah, and the list could go on. There's so many, but I hope that at least answers a little bit of the question in relation to ethics.
No, definitely. And I think that kind of like links with yeah, all of these visual strategies that you create throughout the book, that they're not only visual, but also like, I feel like also written text, you're able to like create this polyphony of voices that they come together as layers, that also those layers, we can see them through the collages. So I think like the idea of like layering materials in different ways kind of like takes your reader and viewer through all of these different connections that you want to trace, that they become like a collective way of understanding. And also relates to what you were mentioning before, this idea of like a digging. I always feel like working with archives, it's kind of like a digging with a shovel, like through layers of time. And you're like bringing up like all of that strata, those layers. And those layers can be different types of materials. And you're able to bring them up and layer them again. But also you're able to create new visual figures. And it's something that for me, it's really interesting. And this is the question when I'm going to ask you about the green chroma. And because I think this is something that doesn't really come from this like past in my understanding, but it's like thinking about the moment that we live and how the green or the idea of the chroma creates this sort of like a transparent effects almost, or kind of like veiling or unveiling materials. That for me, that's the way that I read when you're using the green, and how we can kind of like see or not see through the green. But maybe I'm wrong. And that's why I want to ask you, I would like to know more about the use of the green throughout the book.
Yeah, thank you for that question. You know, the green, the chroma green, I mean, it's not quite Kelly green, not quite, but almost, you know. And I use it in my other work as well, and in Good Hope, as a way to point towards contemporary media, like you say. I think the green screen immediately brings up ideas of staging and fiction. So on the sort of base level, what I'm trying to do is point towards the ways in which there is always a level of staging going on in any image, even the ones that present or purport themselves to be like objective, neutral windows on the world, you know. So the green is just a kind of maybe a little bit gratuitous nod at this fictive world that we live in. And I really believe that photographs, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but I really believe photographs are immensely powerful in shaping what we believe about ourselves and others in the world. And, you know, there is a reason that colonial administrations were so quick to pick up photography as a tool, or many scholars would argue a weapon within a praxis of colonial power. It's because photography is powerful in shaping what we believe to be true. And so long story short, this is the green, and I play with it in sculpturally with my work in the studio. And yeah, I brought it into the book as well.
Yeah, for me, the green, I mean, green screen is obviously the sort of like reference point that is triggered in my brain when I see this specific color of green.
Oh, good.
And it makes me think about photography, and this is something I think about often. Photographs is obviously depictions of something on the other side of the lens, but I think there's a little bit of a two-way two-way streak with cameras, where when you're photographing, you're just as much projecting as you are receiving a projection. So that is the thing that I was thinking about in this context, is that we have this beautiful color of green, and we are given an opportunity to think about projection and what it means to sort of like experience like the projective nature of photography. And just like maybe a little bit of a tangent, but I'm thinking about technology. I'm thinking about media, and I'm also thinking about the way that media is changing very quickly. There is this beautiful point in your book when you're talking about stereoscopes as a technology, the sort of Viewmaster, for going by the name brand, as a tool for both understanding. I think the quote is not only how vision works physiologically, but also how it is codified. What are our manufactured desires? There, I can't help but think about contemporary technologies of vision. In particular, I think of the Oculus, the sort of VR headset, and the technologies and media platforms that are emerging in our moment that utilize basically the same sort of stereoscopic technology,
Right.
but combine that with digital image production and, in relevant to our conversation here, digital image display. So I wonder here if this is a connection you've ever thought about in relation to stereoscopes and VR headsets, even digital photographs or online archives, as archives are increasingly digitized, social media or other technologies that are actively today producing and managing our desires, and of course, risking the reproduction of these cycles of oppression and colonial violence.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that, Kelsey, because at the beginning of the project, before I met you, I think I was really focused, Pablo, you might remember, on contemporary visual technologies, particularly things like facial recognition software and composite portraiture that are used in police sketches, and really looking at the relationship between contemporary visual technology and how it's put to use in service of power. So I don't know if I have anything too illuminating to say, but I certainly think about it a lot. There's a great artist called Heather Dewey Hagborg, and she wrote a text called Sci-Fi Crime Drama with a Strong Black Lead that is a great essay about the racist history of the technology that is currently used by the NYPD and by police all over the world, actually, to identify crime suspects. So she's really looking, she's doing some very interesting stuff in the area of that history, like I said, of the racist history of these technologies and how they manifest. She says, we tend to look at technology systems as neutral black boxes, but if you open them up and look at the component parts, you find that they reflect the assumptions and motivations of their designers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know if that was an adequate answer, but what do you think, Pablo?
Yeah, I mean, I was remembering in the beginning of your project when you were like mentioning like all of these ideas of AI and how they were like related to like face recognition, and you wanted to kind of like start like testing that. And that made me think about also an article that I was reading at the New York Times that talk about the racial bias on AI, and how, again, it's something that it's been programmed by someone, something that it's been completely subjective, even though it's been transformed into an, let's say, quote unquote, objective tool or technology. And I think I just want to kind of like create the connection again with the type of materials that you use and the sources being so analog or archival materials, and thinking also about archives. And I'm always, there are like definitely a lot of like power plays coming into scene when we think about these technologies, or like even like places that hold archives or materials. And it feels like, because there is this sort of like umbrella that makes things official, and those umbrellas are called, like, I don't know, tech companies that sell iPhones to make face recognition, or institutions that are linked to a government, and it's called official archive or national archive. It feels that that umbrella gives enough, I don't know, truth to the history and the subjects depicted. But then when you go into, for example, an archive, and then you see all the different things that have been archived and preserved and the way that they do it, you can really see like a lot of the experience of the person who's in front of that material, making certain decisions based on certain rules that should be neutral. But again, neutral doesn't exist. It's always like neutral. It's kind of like acknowledging or denying certain things. So that kind of like relates to me to this connection with nature. With technology. I was wondering, because I know a bit of this, but I didn't really like follow the entire process of how you were sourcing all the materials for your projects, and if it's a process that it's been difficult for you, being based in the US, or if you've been working with someone in South Africa, or if it's something that you've been doing on distance, or when you've been traveling to South Africa. So how's the process for you, kind of like sourcing the materials that you use for the project?
I do work with someone, and her name is Mom. My mother loves to help me with all of my projects. She always has. And funnily enough, you both might remember a period of time where I was being pretty stubborn. I refused to have images in this book. It was a book of text with no images, because I was so frustrated with images for all of the reasons that we've been discussing, and I shouldn't say images, I should say photographs. I should be a little more specific. I was like, anti, and I still am, but nevertheless. Anyway, so I wasn't going to include images, and my mom and I went to this very white farming community in South Africa on a research trip. So the two of us went, and we stayed with some farmers. And anyway, on the way out of town, we were like, oh, let's just stop at a thrift store. And we went in, and I found this giant box of vintage South African Panorama magazines. Panorama magazine is a was a government subsidized publication by the apartheid government. So it's very much selling this shiny world of benevolent white control and power, right? And in the box, there was also these Africa-themed National Geographics. So I kind of found this giant box that was my collection on one magical day, but my mom also gave me a stack of textbooks from her schooling. So that's like 60s and 70s textbook, so that's also apartheid era. And then I was using family albums and current newspapers. And actually at the moment I'm using eBay. I'm looking for vintage panoramas, and I've been having some luck on eBay. So yeah, always looking, always digging.
So I just had one more question for you. Just sort of returning to the work's like titular theme. I was really struck by the section that's really like at the heart of the book, like physically in the middle. I think it's page 96. When you write about hope broadly and the implications of hope. So you're sort of engaging with Calvin Warren's, who wrote Black Nihilism and the Politics of Hope. And you write, he argues that the popular idea of progress, that is the idea of linear proximity or of moving incrementally closer to a happy ending, allows one to disregard the historiosity of anti-Blackness and its continued legacy. The Politics of Hope, writes Warren's, recasts despair as possibility, struggle as triumph. Later, then you quote James Baldwin when he says, hope and its permanent disappointment, that is no contradiction. So to that, I just wanted to ask where you stand now on the question of hope. What hopes do you maintain, if any, and which permanent contradictions, to quote James Baldwin, are you contending with now?
I actually thought what might be nice is for me to respond by first reading that piece, because I think it will be helpful to give our listeners some context. But would you mind listening to a reading? Okay. A providential understanding of justice and futurity is what Calvin Warren, in Black Nihilism and the Politics of Hope, calls an impossible object. He argues that the popular idea of progress, that is, the idea of linear proximity or of moving incrementally closer to a happy ending, allows one to disregard the historicity of anti-Blackness and its continued legacy. The Politics of Hope, writes Warren, recasts despair as possibility, struggle as triumph. Rebecca Solnit challenges linearity too, while at the same time defending the appreciation of the small, the incremental, and the cumulative. In Hope in the Dark, Untold Histories, Wild Possibilities, she writes that causes and effects assume history marches forward, but history is not an army. It is a crab scuttling sideways, made up of common dreams, groundswells, turning points, watersheds. And hope, she writes, is not like a lottery ticket you can sit on the sofa and clutch, feeling lucky. Hope is an axe you break down doors with in an emergency, because hope should shove you out the door, because it will take everything to steer the future. Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of Hope, Reliving Pedagogy of the Oppressed, also argues for hope rooted in action. Hope, as an ontological need, demands anchoring in practice. Hope needs practice in order to become historical concreteness. These ideas and their delivery cheer me resolutely, such that I'm axe in hand, ready to practice. I'm all hi-ho, let's go, when amidst the euphoric lyricism of wild possibilities, I am brought to a halt by the sentence, hope is a door that is not open to all people at all times. Okay, so hope is not a lottery ticket. It is an ontological need anchored in a practice of axing down doors. But the axe and the door are not available to all people at all times. Still, the despair of those without access must be turned continually to the practice of hoping, if they are to have even a possibility of possessing an axe in an emergency and a door through which the future might be steered towards a happy ending. I'm reminded of an interview transcript I read in the archives of the German newspaper Die Zeit, in which Franz J. Raditz asks James Baldwin about the strange contradiction that characterizes many of his books, a contradiction paralleled, Raditz points out, in Baldwin's expressed desire to return home to a still murderous America after 25 years in exile. Baldwin responds, hope in its permanent disappointment, that is no contradiction. It is late in the day at this point. I've been delivered safely to my sublet bedroom in the Cape Town City Bowl neighborhood of gardens. Sitting in the windowsill, a far cry from hope, I am filled with rage. Still, I am resolute, which is perhaps a kind of hope, to do as Baldwin in the same interview says, to not look away. For as long as people are not willing to see the mountain of rubble, the pile of corpses, the murdering will continue. What happened to me? Me, 1,000 years ago, is happening to me now, Baldwin says to Raditz. I watch a cable car travel slowly upwards towards the dusky golden summit of Table Mountain, feeling the tugging of the uneasy line between the dark hole and the voice in my headphones, a mindfulness meditation called Breathing in Hope, Leaning into Liberty. Soothing in tenor, the British male voice tells me to sit in quiet confidence, to let go of specific outcomes or stories, to locate myself not in the past, nor in the present, nor in the future, but in the present. He tells me to focus on the undulation of my lungs as they expand and contract. Imagine a small glowing light in my sternum. Note my thoughts and feelings. Let them pass like moving clouds.
Thank you so much. That was incredible.
So, I coming from Cape Town, the idea of hope is always going to be like a complicated one, simply because of the word and the baggage that it carries in the Cape of Good Hope, right? And what I interpret Warren to be saying is that by focusing too much on hope and on this kind of future, possible future of a happy ending, we are not focusing on the reality of the present, and therefore the violence just continues. Yeah, there are a lot of contemporary scholars who are writing about hope in this way, and it's why it's difficult for me to answer without speaking about them. A very influential one is Frank B. Wilderson's Afro-pessimism. Then there's George Yancey. In the summertime, as you know, I coordinate the School of Criticism and Theory at Cornell University. And George Yancey was one of the seminar leaders. Last year, he led a seminar called Whiteness and the Phenomenology of Racial Embodiment. And he gave this speech and he mentioned hope. And I'm going to read a passage from it. It's quite quick, but I can't really speak about hope without thinking about this incredibly moving talk that he gave. So if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to give one final reading. Okay, so Yancey began his lecture in 2021 by saying, as counterintuitive as it may seem, in this talk, I will not leave you with much hope, especially as hope itself can function to support racial hegemony, various racial habits, and racial modes of being. If hope means doing more and more theory for the sake of theory, as whiteness continues to dispose and yet consume Black bodies, rendering them abject, I say, no thanks. We need a post-hope, which I see as a species of love that is desperate, where white people are now ready for the world to break up, now ready to lose their identities, to have one's assumptions shattered, to have one's sense of ethical, epistemological, phenomenological, it's such a hard word, embodied an affective certainty called into question, to have oneself touched to the point of vertigo and perhaps even crisis. White people, as James Baldwin would say, must stand and confront history, do battle with forms of historical creation that have gotten us to this place, a place where whiteness and white people refuse or fail to be undone. So I'm all for post-hope at the moment.
So
really cool.
yeah, wow, that was intense. I was just thinking maybe I guess as a final question and kind of like thinking about the idea of hope. I think you've been able to share with us during this conversation, again, all of these different layers that come to your work through the text and the image. But as a sort of like a hope moment, what are you hoping from your readers to get as an experience when they go through your book? And maybe this is just too open as a question, but let's say that it can be more like a small question, kind of like a hope for them when they go through your book.
Well, Kelsey said something earlier about how it helped you to process some things. And that's, yeah, I don't have like, I've given up on lofty hopes, of, I'm going to save the world with this book. No. But I have small hopes for the book, that it will affect people in some way, help them to process, help us to have a conversation. I think that, the first step to unlearning is to look at oneself. And I hope that I can create a gentle space, even though the subject matter is really brutal, that there is somehow enough gentleness that you can live with that reality, that brutal reality, and feel it, So maybe that is a lofty hope, but I've had a few people reach out and express similar things, Kelsey, and I really appreciate hearing those things, obviously. Yeah, and I want people to spend time with the book. I hope that the way that it is designed supports that. And like I said earlier, it is branching out now into sculptures and installations. And I'm not sure where all of that is going to go. A lot of what I'm trying to do is find sculptural gestures that will help to shatter the story further. But the book is its own thing, and it's meant to be something that you can spend time with as long as you need. Whereas, of course, sculptures and that sort of thing, it's operating in a very different way. Yeah, so that's my hope.
That was a lovely way to end.
Yes, absolutely.
Aww. Thank you both so much. The questions were just so thoughtful and wonderful and gave me space to speak about the book in a way I haven't been able to before.
I was thinking if you think that we're missing something, we can always go for part 2 and we start saying, oh, I forget all of these things. Let's go back.
Yeah.